I want you to imagine a familiar house or building with at least 10 different rooms or areas. Now, I want you to imagine walking into the first room. Imagine that in this room, something unusual is missing. For example, you could imagine a chair without legs or a window without glass. And imagine that on this object are the words errors of omission. Now, errors of omission is a term that describes times in which you can't remember information. The memory has been omitted. Now I want you to imagine walking into the second room. Imagine that in this room is something that is not supposed to be there. Maybe you could imagine a bed in a bathroom, for instance. And imagine that on this object are the words errors of commission. And errors of commission is a term that describes false or inaccurate memories. Now we want you to imagine walking into the third room. Imagine that in this room is a rug that covers some objects underneath, unknown objects. And imagine that on this rug are the words retroactive interference. Retroactive interference refers to the notion that information we learn now can impede the memory of information we learned in the past. That is, the new information, in essence, covers the old information. Now finally, I want you to imagine walking into the fourth room. Imagine that in this room is a wall that's painted with a rainbow. The paint is bright and colourful, so bright and colourful that any attempts to repaint the wall are useless. The rainbow continues to shine through. And imagine that on this wall are written the words proactive interference. And proactive interference refers to the notion that entrenched memories can impede our capacity to recall more recent memories. Now this simple exercise actually illustrated 6 concepts. For example, I introduced the concepts errors of omission, or times in which you can't remember information, errors of commission, or false memories, retroactive interference, or times in which new information is impeded by the memory of older information, and proactive interference, or times in which old established memories can impede our capacity to learn or remember newer information. But I also illustrated 2 techniques that can be used to memorize information, the memory palace and then just visualization. So let me talk more about the memory palace. The memory palace merely involves assigning concepts you need to memorize, such as the notion of retroactive interference and proactive interference, to specific locations. In this example, you imagined a label and object that represented retroactive interference in one room. You then imagined a label and object that represented proactive interference in another room. And to retrieve this information, you would merely need to imagine yourself walking into these rooms. Often, this exercise is sufficient to retrieve these memories. And this technique is especially effective if you need to remember these concepts or items in a specific order. Now, people have actually utilized these memory palaces for centuries, once called the method of loci. Even the ancient Greeks and Romans utilized memory palaces to enhance their memory. So why are memory palaces effective? Well, part of the answer revolves around the concept of memory cues. That is, when you imagine a memory palace, you are in essence assigning a cue or hint to everything you need to remember. In this instance, the cue or hint is an image of the room. So when you imagine the cue or the room again, the relevant memory is automatically primed. You remember the concepts almost effortlessly. Part of the answer also revolves around a region of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is vital to the formation of memories. The hippocampus is also vital to spatial tasks, such as mazes or reflecting upon the location of rooms. So therefore, when you imagine a memory palace, and thus complete a spatial task, you actually activate the hippocampus, the very region that is vital to memory. So far, this discussion has assumed that people commit 2 categories of errors, errors of omission and errors of commission. But in his popular book called The 7 Sins of Memory, Daniel Shatner distinguished 3 memories of omission and 4 errors of commission. So the first error of omission is called transience, and specifically, some memories seem to just fade over time. You might remember the definition of retroactive interference now, but may forget this definition tomorrow, and unless you study, will almost definitely forget this definition by next month. Most memories, such as memories of a concert or a meeting, do seem less vivid over time. And indeed, after you see a photo of some event, your memory of this event will tend to be more vivid, and consequently, you tend to perceive the event as more recent, even if the memory was actually quite remote in time. Now, to some extent, retroactive interference can explain partly why memories seem to fade over time. That is, new memories often replace or impede the retrieval of older but similar memories. And one example is the hindsight bias. Suppose you predict that Australia will win a rugby match against New Zealand. You will thus form a memory of your prediction. Now suppose that, surprisingly, New Zealand win the rugby match. You will thus form a memory of this result. Interestingly, this memory of the result will tend to impede the memory of your prediction. That is, you'll often incorrectly believe that you predicted that New Zealand will win. This tendency is called the hindsight bias. That is, we often incorrectly assume that our predictions were accurate. Second, we sometimes forget material only because this information was not encoded properly at the time of learning. That is, we might have been distracted while learning the material. For example, when learning about proactive interference, we might not have reflected upon the key features of this concept enough. We might not have connected this information to concepts that we've already learned. So our attention might have been diverted to something else, and so forth. Now, several techniques can diminish this absent-mindedness. One technique is called self-generation. Any information or materials we generate ourselves, such as questions that we answer in class, are more likely to be remembered later. So to illustrate, whenever I transcribe notes, I actually deliberately omit some of the letters from words. So then when I review my notes later, I need to generate the words myself, to some extent anyway, rather than merely read the words. So I'm therefore more likely to remember the words later. Third, we sometimes experience a phenomenon called blocking. And to illustrate, suppose we imagine a memory palace, but in one room we learn three concepts: retroactive interference, proactive interference, and, say, cats. When we imagine the room again, all three concepts will be activated in our mind to some extent. But the notion of cats will probably be activated the most because this concept is the most familiar to us. And usually only one concept can be retrieved at any particular time. So this activated concept, cats, will tend to block the other concepts. So we'll remember the cat, but not the retroactive interference or proactive interference. Now, the notion of blocking is often used to explain the tip of the tongue phenomenon. That is, sometimes you feel you know the answer to some question, such as what is the capital of Iceland, but you just can't quite articulate the answer. The answer's at the tip of your tongue. Now, presumably the Q, in this instance Iceland, has actually activated many concepts and perhaps blocked the answer to this question from being verbalized. Now, the first error of commission is called misattribution. And that is, we often misattribute the source of some memory. So as a simple example, you might assume that a friend told you the meaning of proactive interference, whereas actually I had told you the meaning of proactive interference. But as a slightly more interesting example, we might experience a tendency called cryptomnesia. And specifically, we might incorrectly believe that we only imagined or dreamt an event that we actually experienced. So we might think that we only imagined that we swallowed a spider, but we actually swallowed a spider. Now, hence, we ascribe this memory to the wrong source, to our imagination, rather than to an actual event. Now, cryptomnesia has actually been utilised to explain some instance of plagiarism. That is, people believe sometimes that they imagined or developed some idea themselves, but they actually read or heard the idea from someone else. And so therefore, these people might not cite these ideas appropriately, leading to accusations of plagiarism. The second error of commission is called suggestibility, although this phenomenon is similar to misattribution. That sometimes the suggestions, the questions, or the comments of other people will elicit false memories in ourselves. For example, suppose someone asks, "When you walked past the bakery, did you see John?" Now this question implies that you walked past a bakery, so you're actually likely to some extent to form a memory that you walked past a bakery, even if you hadn't really walked past a bakery. Now many studies do confirm that our memories are indeed affected by this misinformation. And actually, this misinformation effect is an example of retroactive interference. That is, the information in the question impedes our memory of the previous event. Now, some people are actually more susceptible to this misinformation effect than other people. Specifically, memories are more likely to be contaminated with this information in children, in the elderly, in people whose working memory is limited, in introverts, and also, interestingly, in people who can form very vivid images. That is, people who can form these very vivid images can imagine the misinformation better and hence confuse this misinformation with actual events. Now, two other errors of commission are also important, but sometimes overlooked in textbooks. So one error of commission are biases, often because of emotions. So that is, our emotional state often biases our memories. When we feel happy now, we overestimate the extent to which past memories, such as memories of school, were pleasant. When we feel sad now, we can overestimate the extent to which these past memories were unpleasant. And the final error of commission is called persistence. Specifically, upsetting or traumatic memories tend to persist longer than other memories. That is, aversive events, ranging from, say, a failure at school to maybe a major catastrophe, are often unexpected. And so we thus feel vulnerable. We're concerned that future adversities might arise unexpectedly. And so to overcome this vulnerability, we want to understand the causes of this event better. We want to be able to predict and prevent similar events in the future. And so to understand this event better, we often ruminate over the adversity or trauma repeatedly and unwittingly. And in essence, we relive this experience many times. And so the memory of this experience becomes even more entrenched.